Joining us are Senator Roisin Garvey, leading the discussion with Deputy Brian Ledden and Kerry Green's Chair Alun Dunn and James O'Donoghue from the TFI Local Link Waterford to explore how rural Ireland can move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable, sustainable transport. Roisin, are you there? Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, you can hear me?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, everybody.
I'm going to move you on to chairing the session now. Have a great
Super.
panel.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Welcome to this session. It is great that we have a session for the first time ever, I think, at the Green Party, a whole session on transport from a rural perspective. If I could just move on to the next slide there, Sinead, I'll talk a little bit just for 2 minutes before I introduce our great panel. The next slide, please. Sorry. Yes. So I wanted to highlight this one figure before I get rid of any other images apart from our speakers. So I looked at the CSO figures, and from 2018, you can see we have 60 megatons of carbon emissions in that year. And the total from transport, which is a fifth, was 12 tons. And then the private car owners, like me and most of you probably, was 8 tons. And then looking at them per county, you can see the rural counties play a huge part. So we do need to take rural transport challenges very seriously because we are contributing in a very clear way with regards to our carbon emissions. Now, those figures, 6.88 megatons, don't include all the rural drivers in Dublin, Galway, Cork or Limerick. But of course, they would include maybe people driving in Kilkenny City or Waterford City. But it's just to give you a rough idea of how serious it is, the rural transport issue and the amount of driving we do in rural Ireland. And I suppose that should then be reflected on the amount of spending we do on modal shift and transport in general. So without further ado, you can get rid of that slide now, Sinead. I want to introduce my 3 panelists. Okay, that's just an example of a bus stop that's 3 years old. You can stop sharing the slides now, Sinead. Thanks a million. So we have Brian Ledden, who I would actually know from outside politics from cycling advocacy over the years in our neighbouring county Limerick that are slowly trying to eat into our county, but we're not letting them. I suppose he doesn't walk the talk, but he cycles the talk. So it's great to have him here. He's also our spokesperson for transport, climate and environment. James O'Donoghue, I would know from dealing with Local Link, a total inspiration of a man. Local Link is an amazing service. If you don't know about it, you obviously don't live in rural Ireland. We have increased heavily the amount that has gone to Local Link of yet, but that doesn't mean we're only getting started with supports for Local Links. And James is one of the best I have come across in Local Link with regards to having a positive outlook, but very clear goals as well. And then Anlún, I probably would know mostly because my mother's from Kerry and he's from Kerry, but mainly because he's one of these people that has taken a car off the road and has switched to a cargo bike for using for lots of things. But outside of that, he's probably the most knowledgeable person we have, one of them, on the challenges as a rural cyclist. So without further ado, the plan is that each of the speakers are going to speak for maybe 5 to 8 minutes from their own perspective, and then we'll go straight to Q&A so we can engage with as many people as possible. Overall, the big thing for me is that we have a huge part to play with regards to rural transport if we're taking seriously our carbon emissions reductions. And secondly, I suppose I am one of those people who lives in the middle of nowhere, 5 kilometers from the closest shop or bus stop and 17 kilometers from the closest train. So I have seen firsthand the challenges of trying to get around while also reducing my car dependency. So I suppose I come from the heart in this, and I do think this is the best opportunity we've ever had as a people in Ireland, with Eamon Ryan as Minister for Transport and a huge commitment to the greening of transport. Now we're only in it a year and a half, and we have lots of challenges around the state bodies we work with who might not think like us, but that's what we're going to discuss and lots more today. So I'll open it up with Brian Ledden, please, Brian. And I'll cut you off after 8 minutes if you don't mind.
Okay, thanks for that, Roisin. Hi, everybody. And it's good to be on this panel. I think it's a critically important subject for our party and for our country. I think there's 2 fundamental questions And the first is, why do we want to change transport in rural Ireland? And the second one then is a consequence of how we might answer it. It's how do we change transport in rural Ireland? So just to go with the first one, the why, there are two main reasons, I think, why we as a party should want to do that. The perhaps obvious one at this point is climate. So Roisin mentioned some figures there at the start. It's about 40% of our energy-related emissions are come from the transport sector, and about 20% of overall emissions. So that's very significant. It's about 12 megatons, and in line with the Climate Act, which we passed during the year, we need to get that down to about 6 megatons, so 50% or greater reduction in those emissions. A lot of those emissions are due to rurally generated journeys, primarily private car journeys. So we've a big challenge there. So that's one reason. The second reason is doing things differently makes for a stronger rural Ireland, and that's what we want. We want to rebalance population in Ireland, from the east to the regional cities, and also to the towns and villages of rural Ireland. We're fundamentally in favour of a stronger rural Ireland, and the decisions that we make around transport can contribute to this. So a transport system that is heavily reliant on the private car really counts against that effort to have stronger towns and villages and a stronger rural Ireland. If you have an environment in your town or your village that is hostile to living in the town and the village, then you're simply not going to want to live there. Malcolm Noonan has done a huge amount of work on town centres first, and this is very related to that discussion. How do we make our towns and our villages places where people want to live? And it's quite obvious that tackling the challenges that private car transport brings to their towns and their villages has to be uppermost in our minds. How we use that public space that is currently being used essentially for car parking. How do we get clean air, an environment that is less noisy, streets that are effectively amenities that serve the families and the people that live in the towns and the villages, as opposed to simply being areas for storing private cars. And that's the vision, and that's something we can achieve. It's been done in other countries where we're not reinventing the wheel here, but we probably have to take hard decisions in order to achieve that vision. So that's the general reason why we would want to do this: climate and creating a stronger rural Ireland centered around healthy and vibrant towns and villages where people will want to live and they'll want to raise their families. And if we can do that, if we can get people back living in the towns and the villages, then they become sustainable. Then we start talking about keeping the post office or reopening the post office, reopening the bank, keeping the school, adding a teacher to the local school. It becomes a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle. And we've been on this vicious cycle of the death of rural Ireland for about 30 or 40 years now. And the decisions that we've made around transport have contributed and reinforced that vicious cycle. We can turn that around. So that's the why. And then the next question is the how. And it's the blunt way to do this, I suppose, is to if we look at the climate challenge, that we would say, okay, all those petrol and diesel vehicles that are driving around the place, let's swap them out for electric vehicles, and maybe that solves the climate challenge that we have. And it's only a maybe, to be honest, because there's still climate reasons why electric vehicles aren't perhaps the ideal policy. But is that what we want, and does that solve the other challenge that we have around, that vision that we have, that objective of creating a strong and vibrant rural Ireland? the reason, or the fact is, it actually doesn't. Essentially, a 1-for-1 policy of swapping out petrol and diesel vehicles for electric vehicles, it exacerbates or reinforces a lot of the problems that car-focused rural transport policy has given us over the last 30 or 40 years or more. So really, we have to be more creative around our policy decisions when it comes to transport in rural Ireland. And even with respect to electric vehicles, we have to be creative around electric vehicle policy as well, because we might have a policy target of 1 million electric vehicles, or I think it's 845,000 private electric vehicles by 2030. But there needs to be nuance to that. If you want to deliver the emissions cuts that you need by 2030, then it makes sense to have a detailed and nuanced electric vehicle policy that simply isn't about a big number that you're trying to achieve. It doesn't make any sense for the state to be subsidizing electric vehicles, for example, in our major cities, where the state isn't going to get a carbon dividend. Doesn't make sense for the state to be subsidizing people who can afford electric vehicles to purchase them. So we're really at the start of this debate at the moment around electric vehicles, and we need to get into the nitty-gritty and the detail of it, because that top line ambition of 1 million electric vehicles by 2030 might be fine, but it really needs to be broken down into detail, and there's a big discussion to be had on it. But generally, we need to be more creative about transport in rural Ireland. And I think that's where things are going to go. And I'm looking forward to hearing James speaking. James has vast experience with rural bus services. And I do think that rural bus is going to be a major player as we go forward. We have to get to a point where the bus services and rail, where possible, provide an attractive alternative to driving. And so, these services shouldn't just be for people who can't afford cars, although that's critically important too. There's a real equity issue around transport policy to date, but for very strong environmental reasons, we should be attracting people who are currently driving, who can afford cars, onto other more sustainable modes. And for the longer journeys, the bus is going to, or has to become, the answer for a lot of those journeys. The Connecting Ireland plan, which was announced there a few weeks ago, is definitely a step in the right direction. I have 1 minute left. Okay, so step in the right direction. We're going, about 70% of the population is going to have a service, I think 3 services a day. So instead of towns and villages having 3 bus services a week, to go from that to 3 services a day is very good progress. I think really we need to be getting to every village every hour. That's what some countries in Europe are doing, the Swiss and the Germans, and in England as well, they're doing it. And it's actually not that expensive to do it. And we need to, it comes back to that question around that I mentioned about EVs, like, the grants for EVs are going to cost the state billions, tens of billions over the next decade. We should be putting serious money into rural bus services, but it wouldn't be anything like the money that would be required to get to the 1 million electric vehicle level by 2030. I'm probably all out of time, Roisin, am I?
We'll get you again, Brian. Don't worry, you're not going anywhere.
Okay,
We'll cut you off for now, though, if that's okay.
Good.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. There is no one solution, and I think the whole thing is we have to join all the dots up, whether it's cycling or local link or bus Éireann or services. I do think there's a hugely important point there about the frequency. I was thinking about Dublin Coach. We have one in Ennis, and it leaves every hour. So people know it, and they know there's one every hour. And you see people who use cars starting to use that now to go from Ennis to Limerick for events, whether it's nighttime or daytime, because now it's a reliable service that they know of. Whereas with in general, it's very hard to know when is the next bus in rural areas. So yeah, I think even though we've improved, I think every village, every hour it should be our ultimate goal. But thanks for that. I'm going to invite in James next. I think I said it was. James, would you like to come in here and impart some amazing knowledge about the challenges and the amazingness of Local Link?
Yes, thanks very much, Roisin. I'll try and get through the challenges in 8 minutes if I can, but I'll try and keep it fairly brief. So firstly, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's great to get that. Sitting here in Dungarvan, I suppose I'm one, or at least I'm the manager of one of 15 Local Link companies across the country, and we manage rural transport services on behalf of the National Transport Authority under contract. So here in Waterford, we'd operate something in the region of 50 services of all shapes and sizes, ranging from demand services, where we literally go from door to door picking up people, to regular rural services, which actually run on a fixed schedule services, operating from bus stop to bus stop. And I'll get to that in a minute about bus stops. So our busiest one on those, for instance, would run 12 return services a day. So we're managing a huge range of services now compared to where we were when we started, well, particularly when we started in 2002. So, I mean, it's to be welcomed where we've gotten to, but there's a lot, I believe, that we need to look at. Our passenger journeys were something like 135,000 in 2019, just before COVID. Our budget here in Waterford at the moment would be 2 million a year. 3/4 of that would be on services, and we have a staff of 4. So I suppose picking up on what Brian says, the requirement maybe to enable people to make the necessary changes to their mobility habits, their mobility patterns, whether they're going for work, education, recreation, whatever it would be, requires us to provide a viable alternative. And that's, I think, where we need to focus. And in that vein, I do welcome the Connecting Ireland programme and the plan, which will see an extension of rural services over the next 5 years. But there are a couple of issues that I would like to address in terms of where we're at the moment. So just briefly taking a step back, in 2014, the National Transport Authority were given responsibility for the development of the Rural Transport Programme. And they established what are called Transport Coordinating Units, or TCUs. You might hear me referring to TCUs a bit over the next few minutes. So that's what we are. We're transport coordinating units in each of our individual counties or group of counties operating services for the National Transport Authority. So we developed from scratch, and we manage the services on behalf of the National Transport Authority. And we were also given a role of being the catalysts for the integration of all public transport services in our counties. And I suppose the other main leg of that was that we were to maintain the community and voluntary input that we had up till then, and we were to do that through the involvement of voluntary boards of directors, and all that was to be done in alignment with local authority structures. So that was the plan. As I say, however, there are issues in that, and the first one, if I could talk about, would probably be the structures. So I think the question for me is, why are we continuing to operate what are now significant public transport services through charities? The structure underpinning the operation of Local Link services, as I said, sees 15 what are really community and voluntary boards managing services under contract to the National Transport Authority. But the results of that really are that, first of all, companies are now tendering against each other for services. Community and voluntary boards are really swamped in terms of the governance requirements for the charities regulator, the Companies Office, and so on. All necessary stuff, but community and voluntary people that we invited onto our committees way back when to look at the development of public transport in their counties now spend most of their time at meetings looking at governance and policies. And to that extent, we actually are losing our community and voluntary input into the boards and finding it very difficult to replace them. The contract then for the transport coordinating units, each of our own, that was actually put out to tender by the National Transport Authority in 2018. So all of us that were involved with 15 odd years at that stage in rural transport had then to tender for the operation of local links in our counties. And that would be due to be renewed again in 2023. So in that, the NTA, National Transport Authority, allowed companies to apply for up to 5 TCUs. So you then had companies competing against each other for neighbouring TCUs, and obviously the loss of some local link offices in areas. County Clare is an obvious example where all services there now are operated out of Limerick. And in terms of, there's been really little or no progress in terms of the alignment with local authorities. That hasn't happened. So I think overall, to me, it's very much a dysfunctional structure. And there's poor strategic control in the sense that, if I could give you an example of local links competing against each other, because we don't have a role in non-emergency health services, we have to tender to operate those. So when HSE Southeast decided they wanted to put this management of their renal services, renal transport in the Southeast out to tender, a group of us down here, Kilkenny, ourselves in Waterford, Wexford and Tipperary, tendered for that, but we lost it. We lost the tender to Local Link Donegal. So you now have Local Link Donegal managing renal services for the HSE in the Southeast. So how that makes sense on a strategic level, I'm not so sure. And the other issue I'd like to address is the way we manage transport, public transport, particularly in this country, in terms of silos, where the HSE have responsibility for non-emergency health services and continue to contract private operators in to do that. The Department of Education and Skills have responsibility for school transport, and then the Department of Transport obviously responsible for all other land transport. And we sit in the middle of all that, but we have very little input into non-emergency health. We've been specifically told by the NTA that we have no involvement in school transport. So the whole notion that we would have a role in integrating these services and you know, the consequent savings that could arise from us having an overall view of all the public transport in the counties just isn't happening. And as far as I'm concerned, while we continue to operate as independent limited companies, that situation will remain the same. It also means that we don't have the ability to look at a critical mass of services in terms of how we might integrate them in the first place. So really, any integration that's happening is only happening within the remit of the services we're running ourselves at the moment. So if I could, I asked the question of, and I accept what Brian said in terms of connecting Ireland, but I still have to ask, is this a matter of resources or is it a matter of priorities? In 2018, we here in Waterford submitted a plan to the NTA for bus stops. Thought it was an obvious one that they might give us bus stops to go with the services we were running. That was 2018. To date, we haven't seen as much as one bus pole in County Waterford. As I said, we're running, one of our services carries something like 75,000 passenger journeys a year. No bus stop, no pole, no place to put up any information, you know the usual. And as I said, to date, we see no development of that. Now, the NTA are rolling out a programme. It came up in the discussions in the context of Connecting Ireland, because Connecting Ireland is obviously a 5-year programme. And I can come back to that, which I think is way too long for the services that we need. But we were told that the improvements in bus stops that are required across the country is a 10-year programme. So I don't know how that matches up. But as I said, the problem is, if I was to pick any town in County Waterford, and I'd pick one called Dunhill, which is right in the middle of the county, 10 services a day, no bus stop, no pole, no anything to even let people know that there's a public transport service running through there. I'll conclude, Roisin, by saying if you were to ask me where do I think we should go from here, there was a couple of things in the programme for government I think we need to address straight away. The first one was there was to be a review of local link services and funding. I think that should be done straight away. I think it should be expanded to look at the structure, and I think it should look also at the possibility of placing a statutory emphasis on the development of rural transport services. Nobody is obliged to talk to us. That's a problem. The National Public Transport Forum that was mentioned should be set up straight away. And finally, the Department of Transport carried out a sustainable mobility policy review. It was being concluded in 2019, but obviously because of COVID, there has been delays there. I think we need to pick up on where that is at the moment and see what was the department's thinking itself around the development of mobility service, the development of rural transport services. Thank you.
Wow, such insight, James. Yeah, reminding me of the mess we had with losing Clare Bus, which was got from the ground by amazing people like Laura and them, and then to be just dismissed completely. It's such a valid point about this tendering and competing and the lack of strategy and the waste of money and the lack of bus stops. And I mean, Local Link is brilliant, but trying to find out where you get the bus or the timetable is a nightmare. So really, really insightful there. And this is just the beginning of this, James. We'll be meeting again. We do have to take those things from the Forum for Government and work hard. But I suppose that's why I asked for this event to start to kick it off here at the Green Party Convention, that we put it on, move it up the priority scale. There is so many things to deal with regards to transport in every element of society. But yeah, it's so great to have you involved in this, and I really appreciate your input there, James. Very, very important points made by you.
Thanks, Roisin. Delighted to work with you.
On Luan, we'll kick you off there, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning like I did with the lads.
Great stuff.
No major panic. Thanks,
Roisin. Yeah, and delighted to be here and to contribute. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and I hope you can see it. I'm just going to use some photographs to lead this part of the input, mainly because I think painting a picture is really useful. And what I'm hoping to do today is to tell a brief story about cycling in rural Ireland. And briefly about my experience of cycling in rural Ireland, and share some thoughts on perception, vision, priority, and also some ideas of making people want to move to cleaner transport. For ourselves personally, we've sold our second car. We bought a cargo bike for our daily trips, and we try to use public transport when it's possible to do so. But we are the converted, and we're also the fit and the brave, or possibly stupid, depending on the time of the day that you choose to go out into traffic and entertain some of the driving that's going on. But this to just show what cycling is perceived as in rural Ireland by rural dwellers. It's people on fast sport-specific bikes wearing cycling gear, and much to the complaint of drivers, they're always cycling 2 abreast or 4 abreast or 8 abreast, depending on who's exaggerating the story. And in many ways, this is an understandable perception, as from inside the car, this is what people who do not cycle see most often. But this is also rural cycling. I spent much of my life, my youth certainly, living in West Kerry, where I use my bike to go everywhere. We live 2 kilometres from the nearest shop, 10 kilometres from Dingle, and everyone my age cycled. It was the only way to meet your friends, go to the beach or buy an ice cream. And my parents felt confident that it was reasonably safe to do so, to go cycling on our roads, because they were seen as quiet. And as they were seen as quiet, people were more inclined to go for a walk or for cycle to get around the place. And it was generally accepted as the norm. But this is not the case today at all, as we all know. Our wealth has enabled people to buy more than 1 car per household. Our collective lack of vision has led to car-centric planning, like Brian mentioned earlier on. And this has in turn led to higher speeds for cars, lower safety for people not inside a car. And as a result, parents today wouldn't themselves cycle on a rural road, much less allow an unaccompanied child to do so. On the left here, you can see my own kids cycling on an 80-kilometre-an-hour road outside of Entry. And you can see my position on my bike is outside of them. So I'm seeking to protect them. In the middle, you can see my son sitting inside in what is a pretty expensive cargo bike. And again, he's sitting inside in that bike because I'm trying to protect him. And on the right, you can see the freedom attained when safety is no longer a concern. As my kids and my nephew, both or all of them enjoy the newly opened Limerick Greenway, which is just a real freedom giver, despite its lack of integration into the local communities. For the past decades, the needs of the person choosing the bike to get around has been ignored by planners, really. People bought more cars, roads were improved for cars got faster as a result, and then people stopped cycling. In July of last year, the Irish Cycling Advocacy Network produced their Vision for Cycling in Rural Ireland, which was launched by Minister Malcolm Noonan. The vision itself has 8 asks. Many of these statements reflect the position of the bicycle in Irish society. Particularly, I draw your attention to number 3, which is, kind of indicates where the bicycle sits in the priority list. Many of these issues arise around design. And when you have an advocacy group calling for simple things like best practice for design of routes where a bike is an appropriate mode of travel for the distance, you know something is seriously flawed in our collective approach to transport design. We need to talk about what needs to change, and we've been told for years that funding is a problem, and I simply don't buy that anymore. I think it's a priority problem, like James mentioned, and like Brian mentioned before him. From the RSA, the NTA, and TII, and all the way down to the local authorities, these instruments of the state, they have to do better, because right now they're not attaching the priority we need to really make cycling or walking a viable option for all or part of your journey. Local and national policy must target the private car in the same way that we targeted smoking indoors, plastic bags, or single-use plastics, and we must move from promoting active travel to demanding it. The NTA, TII, and most importantly, the local authorities must no longer be cajoled. We must be instructing them to change their priorities, to plan more effectively, and to implement the standards set out when designing our roads and streets. Because at the moment, our roads and streets are the domain of the fit and the brave, who are confident enough to compete with SUVs and trucks and cars for space. And this is not a situation we've suddenly found ourselves in either. It's a result of a series of decisions. It's a long-running commitment to provide for the motor vehicle above all else, and it has to stop. We need lowered limits, particularly on our R and L roads. Our villages must become communities. If you look at Ventry Village on the bottom left of your screen, I mean, it's a car park. It's a beautiful part of the world, but it's a car park with 3 roads running into what could be a beautiful green area. We need to reduce the speeds, particularly in rural villages, down to 30 kilometers an hour. And you'll see one of the local link buses that we took during the summer when we were out in Ventry, but it can't take a bike on it unless the driver is amenable to allowing it to occupy the wheelchair space, which is unfair because you're then discommoding somebody else with other needs. So we need our buses to be able to take bikes. We need bigger buses potentially, or bike racks on buses. And we need bus stops. James touched really heavily on the bus stops. If your bus stop isn't essentially a luxurious space with all such things as shelter from the rain and the wind, lighting to make you feel safe and secure at nighttime, and somewhere to lock your bike, as simple as that. Because if you live up the back of a boreen and you've got 500 meters to get to the bus, then you need to get there, and the bike is the easiest way to do that. And we really need to start looking at that multimodal option around bike share schemes. I mean, Dublin has fantastic Dublin bikes, which I use very regularly, but we don't see that outside of any of our cities. There's no reason why our towns and villages couldn't have something similar. And really what this all comes down to is better planning. Planning which aims to enable active modes first and actively works to make the private car inconvenient. We have to stop allowing the private car all the way into the middle of our towns and villages and through them. I mean, there's something to be said for some bypasses, certainly, but really we just need to get the cars off the roads. Like Brian said, EVs aren't the answer. They're just supplementing one private vehicle for another. And it comes down to emissions only, not all of the community benefits that we see by eliminating the car and targeting it. And like all climate action, we need this now. We don't need it in 6 months or 12 months or 36 months or 10 years time. We need it now. And just to finally illustrate the point of how to enable active travel or public transport, I'm planning a trip to Dublin in the next couple of weeks with my family to visit relations in Clontarf for an important family birthday. On the left-hand side of my screen, you'll see Tralee to Clontarf is 3 hours and 28 minutes, 311 kilometers, and it'll probably cost us about €70 in diesel and tolls. And on the right is the train plus public transport in Dublin. It's going to cost us €160, and it's going to take us 5 hours and 10 minutes. If we don't address that trend, you're never going to get people to really and truly choose to get out of their cars and choose a better mode of transport, one that's better for the climate, but is most importantly best for our communities. It's only the right thing to do. Thank you.
Absolutely mind-blowing. Well done, Anlúin. Exactly what he said, everybody. Yeah, just a couple of comments, and I go to some things in the Q&A as well. Look, Anlúin, I mean, I worked on modal shift with schools all over Clare and Galway and Limerick for 14 years, trying to engage with local authorities and the NTA. I worked with city schools and 2 teacher schools up mountains, and it's always been the challenge. They would say, the powers that be, they didn't have the funding or the staff. Now they have both, thanks to the funding given by Minister Eamon Ryan since he became Transport Minister. So there obviously is a whole other issue around priorities there that you rightly said. I have actually costed the price of bike racks on buses and brought it to the NTA. I have costed the price of a town bike scheme like we have in our cities, one for every town, the capital town in every county. That's just a starting point. But you know, these are things. I do hear what you're saying. I know people like me and Brian are working on these things. I do know that Mullingar are actually going to start a bike scheme, so I think that's really positive. Bleeper have been working with them, and I think as soon as we see one town doing it, hopefully that will inspire other local authorities. I've approached my own, and they have put it off for 3 or 4 years to get involved in some messy mobility thing they're doing with the NTA. I thought they might, God forbid, they might actually say yes. I had costed for them for Shannon and Ennis, and I thought, look, I'll get you the money. Will you just say yes? And they just said maybe in a few years' time. So I completely agree with everything you said, and the whole thing about, you know, bikes on buses, bike racks. It's a grand to get a bike rack for 4 bikes on a bus. I've costed it, and it is a bus stop is €1,000. 2 bus stops, you have to have one at opposite sides of the road, €1,000. So you know, they're not big spends, and these things need to be done. I will go to the chat box there and maybe see if any of the speakers want to come in on anything else anyway. One person said the service is clearly a victim of the move to privatise everything 20 years ago. And of course, transport should be taken back into the public sector. 100%. Very good point by John Humphreys there. And Liz Coakley Wakefield, and you can comment on these afterwards. Do any of the speakers know of any example in Ireland of where there is a shuttle bus between a village and a tourist spot? In West Cork, for example, it would be great to have one between Schull or Durrus and Barley Cove. Now, I do know the NPWS provide a free shuttle bus service from Corrafin into the Burren, but it's the worst advertised and the least utilised service I've ever come across. I don't know if any of you have any examples of a shuttle service. It is something I've put in for the Burren. I think we should have proper regular shuttle services to these tourist spots, because the people are throwing their cars all around our national parks instead.
And just pick up on that, Roisin.
Yeah.
I know Local Link Wexford do a service from, I think it's New Ross down to the Hook Lighthouse and that, which is a very busy route. But I think it's a summer service, so we'll be operating at the moment. Equally, under Connecting Ireland, I've put in plans for a service, a hopper service along the Waterford Greenway, and I've put in plans for one that would support the walking trails in the Cumber Mountains, where we would do a kind of a hail and ride car park to car park service. I was told by the NTA that these are not even on their horizon. Now, these are I was looking at the photograph that Anlúin had up on the beach. You could replicate that at every beach and every trailhead in Waterford during the summer. Absolute chaos. And yes, we can't get funding to run hopper services or bus services. Thanks. Yeah,
I mean, one of the problems, there's a photograph. If I had it to hand, I'd share it. But there's a photograph of Inch Beach, which is out on the Dingle Peninsula, and Inch Beach has a small car park, a small cafe, and showers, etc. But the council allow parking on the beach, so there's a roadway that essentially leads onto the beach. And there's an absolutely horrific photograph from the summer, because everyone's staycationing, which is brilliant, but everyone drove to the beach. And they drove to the beach because the bus service that Local Link had been providing to Inch wasn't being used. And it wasn't being used because it wasn't frequent enough. So if you were going with 2 kids and a bucket and spade and a load of stuff, it wasn't frequent enough to be able to get home. It wasn't convenient enough. And that's what it leads to. It's not convenient enough. And instead, we ended up with literally 100 and something cars parked on the beach. where instead of being a safe environment for the kids to run around and build a sandcastle and run into the water, you're now worried in the same way you'd be worried if you were walking down through a busy town as to what the cars were doing in close proximity. So there was no chance of a kick of a ball or a slap of a sliotar. It was just not going to be a possibility. So I think there's definite need for bus services to tourism spots, but I think we have to assess what the needs of the people are. It's not like commuting for work or education when it might be one individual going from one point to another. It can be a load of gear, a load of very sandy and possibly wet kids wanting to get home quickly and conveniently. And so it would be the regularity of the services that would solve something like that.
Yeah. Brian, do you want to come in there? Will I go through a few more things coming in the chats? There's some good
Just
comments.
looking at loads of questions are coming in there. Yeah,
I
just
think
looking at
we're everybody here is in agreement with everybody else here.
There's a question there around, how do we ensure that we're targeting resources correctly?
Yeah, I was going to read that one out there. Sheila Bridgedine Gannan has a good question. How do we ensure that we are targeting resources correctly to tackle car dependency with both infrastructure and provision of services? And how are we feeding into national agencies' decision-making to ensure we get the best impact in reducing emissions and improving quality of life? I have loads to say on that, but Brian, will I let you take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it relates to the points that both James and Donlún and yourself, Roisin, were making in the last few minutes. Like, we know intuitively, we know that there's a lot that can be done to improve the appeal of bus services or rail services or walking or cycling in rural areas. But what we're probably not very good at is, knowing precisely how effective all those measures. You could come up with hundreds of measures really that we think will be effective in some way or other. But I don't think the department have a system of modeling these kinds of measures to show how effective they will be. And if we don't have that sophisticated modeling, then we're shooting in the dark, actually. We're not being effective at where we target the resources. So I think that has to happen in the next few years. Very, very detailed modeling needs to be developed, and I don't think we're there yet. And I know from the regional transport strategies, it almost seems as if the modeling is dictating the policy when it should actually be the other way around. It should be, this is what we want to achieve, and let's create the model which will then give us an insight into the various measures that will lead to that objective that we're trying to achieve. So frankly, I don't think we know the answer yet. And we've got to, if we're serious about actually reducing emissions in transport by more than 50% within 10 years, and bringing about all the co-benefits, with modal shift, then if we don't develop these models, then we're really just paying lip service to it, and we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve.
Yeah, I think that we have, I don't know if we're finishing at 1:15 or 1/2. I thought it was 1/2, but then I was told it's 1/4. I want to get other people's voices just to read out a few comments. There aren't that many questions, but people obviously have passionate feelings about this. Just on a point of information, Karen Power said that Mullingar has a bus going from the town centre to the Greenway, as far as I know. Another person made a good point about greenways that has been rectified in some areas where they were made just for tourists and not for locals, and the connectivity had to be fitted in afterwards, retrospectively. I remember Niall Cousins saying that about the Dublin to Athlone one. They had done it for tourists and forgot to connect to the local schools and villages. So it cost them an arm and a leg to do retrospectively. So hopefully that won't be happening in the future. Finn makes a good point that James had kind of touched on. The community and voluntary sector has had the delivery of public services foisted on them. That brings us back to this integrated structure and strategy needed. Makdara and Whalevua, a wise man, once said that the motor car and the television ruined rural Ireland. We can't go backwards, but there is a conviviality that transport methods such as cycling, walking can provide that is beneficial to well-being on multiple levels. Sorry, that jumped there. Peter Hamilton said, well done for the great and challenging presentation on Luan. Roseanne White, what can we do to make greenways work as transport for local people instead? Sorry, I was answering that. How much for bike share schemes in a town? Marianne, if you email me, it all depends on the size of the town. I won't go throwing off figures now off the top of my head, but if you email me, I'll send you the costings I have for the various towns of various sizes. Pádraig Mackey, how much would it cost to make Local Link free? Looking at my local service, it's a €5 return, 4 times the cost of a journey by EV. I don't know how many people are comparing their EV cost to the Local Link cost just yet. I know in Clare, our Local Link is €3 return too. I think it's still so. Anyway, I hear what you're saying if we're going to go EV, but for people who are paying for petrol and diesel, it's 170 a litre. They might find the €5 not so bad. We have very fragmented transport services providers in the country. Yes, that's what we're talking about. What do the panelists think about governance reform of agencies? That's what Brian is touching on there, I suppose, really. I mean, I think we don't have any consistency in the local authorities, and that's because the NTAs aren't insisting upon it. So we see it very
I think there's a sense, Roisin, that like the government has set forth a vision in the programme for government, and the question really is, are the various transport agencies, the National Transport Authority, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, the local authorities and others, are they on board with the vision? You know, and is there a lag there between the government policy and ultimate implementation? There's a question there, Roisin, just on the greenways. What can we do to make greenways work as transport for local people instead of just bringing tourists to viewing points? I think we have to see there's huge tourism potential with greenways, but there's huge utility transport potential with greenways as well. Often greenways can be one or the other, but we should be trying to make them both. And there are good examples of where, like urban greenways, actually, like here in Limerick, there's 2 examples. There's one by the Shannon River, which connects the university with the city. It was an old towpath, about 5 kilometers long. Not that many people ever walked on it, and they certainly didn't cycle on it. The last government invested significantly in it, and now it's a really, really good transport link, active travel transport link between the city and the suburb of Castletroy, where the university is. We can do a hell of a lot more of this kind of thing, and we should, because it does come down to that question about targeting resources and what are we actually trying to achieve. And tourism is very positive. There's huge benefits for the rural economy, obviously, but we're in a climate emergency, and we have to change people's transport behaviors. Essentially, we have to get them out of private cars and onto bikes and walking and onto buses.
Brian, I suppose just a question on that then, right? So, and it kind of comes back to the prioritization piece from the designers, right? So in the case of the Limerick Greenway that I showed in the photograph, like if you're in Abbeyfield and you want to get on that greenway, you've got kids on bikes, etc., you've got a kilometre to cycle out to get to the greenway, which is the car park. The trailhead's a car park, and then when you get to the next village along, which I think is Templeglantine, there's no connection. It's a rural road, and in the main poorly surfaced, and very little in the way of signage as well. And I think that's an indication of the way these greenways are being developed, in that they're a strip from one end through to the other, and they're expected by the designers that you're going to drive your car with your bikes on the back, or you're going to rent a bike and you're going to cycle, and you're going to cycle back to your car, and then you're going to drive home. And when we were campaigning down here with the Tralee to Fenagh Greenway, they had initially envisaged that greenway as a start and an end point, and with no connectivity for local communities along the way, despite the fact that there are several schools that would hugely benefit from this. So I think there's a definite, it kind of comes back to that prioritization and where we are in the lag with policy translating into action on the ground, and how national and local agencies are actually taking that on board. And back to what I was saying about cajoling people or seeking will to get this stuff done. At what point do we say this is national policy and we are indicating to you that you must deliver upon it? And who do we need to convince to make that happen? Seeking goodwill from some superstars within the NTA, the TII or local authorities is no way to deliver overall policy. So how do we make them do it, so that the
there's
detractors
a
aren't
couple of
allowed
things
a
there.
small third, you know.
I think there's a couple of things there. I know that myself and Brian have just recently got commitment from Eamon Ryan to sit down with the NTA to do just that, because we see in some ways it has to come from top down. We can't trust it to come from bottom up when it comes to local authorities. They don't all have the expertise that's needed, and it is very hit and miss between local authorities. And the second thing I think that's come up out of this discussion is that Catherine and Eamon probably need to sit and look at, because I know for Greenways it's often designed by Fáilte Ireland are the ones funding it. And we all know what Fáilte Ireland prioritise, and it's tourism, which is great and all, but it's no longer acceptable to be putting in infrastructure that isn't taking into account the people who live in the area and to give them choices. So look, I'm going to try and get a few more comments in, but I'm not sure how much time we have left. I hear your pain there, Conor Scott. I was in Doolin last August, he says, waiting for the bus from Galway to Ennis. It was due at 11:55 a.m. It arrived at 3:05 p.m. That is surely unacceptable. My son, that happened to him several times this summer. He works in Doolin and was trying to get the bus back to Ina. He often was waiting for hours. They don't seem to understand or have understood the concept that there's traffic problems in Galway that delay them all the time. Yeah, it's frustrating. Every village, every hour, says Sasha Novak. Integrated service is the ideal concept. Absolutely. We said that at the beginning of the session. With the lack of local knowledge and accountability of the NTA and no local autonomy over the public transport, how do our speakers envisage the concept to be delivered in practice? I guess that's one of the reasons why myself and Brian were pushing for this meeting with the NTA. I found out that our chief designer, I won't say in which county, the design director of design or planning was the one feeding into the NTA about Connecting Ireland. And I found that really worrying, because the same man wouldn't know a bike if it hit him in the face. So I just think we have to get the right people into the room, and we have to get our policies that we fought long and hard for on the programme for government, and get these government agencies to implement them. So I think that's important. It seems they've been working in silos. The NTA and the local authority have been doing their thing. And now the Greens are in government, and we have a good Minister for Transport, and it's time to up our game and demand more of them. I think that's a really important thing that's come out here. We need Catherine Martin to reward sports clubs which choose sustainable locations for sports facilities. Very good point, because the GAA have this big greenwashing thing going on at the moment. I saw a big billboard outside Folk Park about it. Rural transport session was one of the best and most forward-looking at the day so far, said Peter Hamilton. We'll take that. And Luttrell, what about school transport in cities as well as the countryside? Yeah, I think we're going to stick to rural transport issues for today, but I hear what you're saying. I know that there is some good things happening with student prices for local services in cities. Thumbs up for Marianne Butler. Padder of Yunon, what sort of infrastructure measures can we promote for, say, 2 miles from small towns where cycle lanes won't be practical? Let's answer that question, because that's definitely a specific rural transport issue and one I feel passionately about. Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, very happy to. I know Anne is probably bursting to come in on that one as well.
Me too.
It's speed limits, right? We need safe roads. We need to bring the speed limit on a lot of our local roads right down, and you know we need to, like, this concept in the cities of the low traffic neighborhood. That can be applied in rural Ireland as well, where you keep the cars on the main thoroughfares, and you make it hard or less appealing for them to take shortcuts cross country, and then those local roads are just for local traffic and for local people. And there's a hell of a lot you can do there. The Dutch do this really, really well, and I'd say Anlún probably wants to come in. So.
I'll keep it brief, because I know that there's other stuff we want to get through. I think through traffic is one of the major things we could tackle right now. And this doesn't apply to every town or village, and some towns or villages are a crossroads where the regional traffic goes through. But if we stopped in the larger towns, and I'll give Tralee, because I live here as an example. If we stopped cars driving through town, you'd have less cars. They'd go around the ring road and they'd be out of here. The people who need to get into town, they'll still be able to park, but they can't go through town. As a result, you cut it down, and then if you make it where they're essentially a series of cul-de-sacs, the vehicle speeds automatically come down. We're one of the few towns that have successfully implemented 30 km/h speed limits, but then they need to be implemented. and enforced. So there's kind of a bit of buy-in from An Garda Síochána as well in enforcing lower speed limits. We have in Ireland, I think 90-something% non-compliance with 30 km/h speed limits, and that has to be addressed really. But I mean, it's not all about cycling either. I mean, if we want to reduce the cars, we need more buses. We need town buses in Ennis. We need them in Tralee. We need them in Killarney. And I suppose it's a question from me to James is like, does Local Link see itself as being in a position to begin to provide town bus services, not just those rural connections? Because if you can arrive into a town, but there's no bike share scheme and you can't bring your bike in the bus, then you're walking. So if there's no local bus to get you around that town or that village, then what do you do next?
Yeah, and for those who maybe have to drive because they're older or, you know, for one reason or other, at least if they could park at the edge of the town and get the town bus around, it'd be good. I mean, I've been trying to get this speed limit thing, you know, even in our housing estates, it's 50k. I mean, 50k in a housing estate is insane. Not to mention the fact that we have 80k on the narrowest roads all around rural Ireland. It is the speed is a huge
You know, we
issue.
have a design manual for urban roads and streets, which really is quite good, and it says what design interventions are effective at basically making streets more livable, more attractive, less car oriented. But maybe we need a design manual for rural roads now as well, because like there's very specific design interventions that can make it less appealing for the car to go up there. You know, maybe it is bollards halfway down the road, so there's no through road, as Anlún suggested. Maybe it's constrictions, you know, so that they can't get to where they want to go faster via the local boreen. You know, there's a heap of things that you can do to make it less attractive for that unwanted traffic to go down these local roads at speed. And I'm not aware of any guidance that's there on that in Ireland for local authorities.
We have that 1.5 Staying Alive campaign that he actually got it over but I mean, I cycle on our main road. Holy God, nobody's giving me 1.5 meters. Nobody's even giving me 1 meter. And I don't know if we've got to do more to remind. I had it written down here, you know, every car driver, every new license for a truck or car driver should have to do a cycling test as well, because, you know, when you cycle, you know what it's like. So if you're in a car and you see a cyclist, you can empathize with them. So there is a huge thing there. I mean, I know we can't get everybody retrospectively doing cycle training, but I'm not sure if people should be given license to drive trucks or cars if they don't know what it's like, what it feels like to be a cyclist on the road. And I think there's a lot of ignorance around that. I think if they knew what it felt like, they probably would give us more space. I definitely became more aware, you know, as a car driver myself around cyclists because of my cycling.
Roisin, if
Yeah,
I could ask
there's
one
so
question
much
there.
there really, isn't there? But I mean, it's not just about cycling in rural Ireland. There is going to be people using cars, but it is to give them other options that are affordable and make sense, like the Local Link, which is, for me, Local Link is very important because we have these public service operators. Maybe people don't know, they're called PSOs, and they usually go from town to town, village to town. The PSO, the Local Link then would be the ones that would go where there is no PSO service, which is where you're really getting into the weeds of people who live in the sticks, like myself, in rural Ireland.
There's probably another session starting. It's 5:30. James is keen to come in there.
No,
Okay, James,
No, just somebody asked about making Local Link services free. Just fair income accounts for about 7% of the recovery cost. So in other words, making it free wouldn't cost an awful lot more. We're only recovering 7% anyway. And in terms of local authorities, we really need to look at the remit local authorities have, particularly statutory remit in terms of public transport, which as far as I know is none. So that's why they don't do it. They're good at roads, they're not good at public transport. And as I said, then we don't have a statutory remit around public transport. So that's I think where we need to look.
Yeah, a lot more to do. I don't know if we'll wrap it up there, lads. It's past. This is only the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot of passion and enthusiasm there. I would like to encourage people who are here today, if they want to get in contact directly with me or with Anlún. We're both on the Rural Transport Policy Committee, and Brian as well, because we are taking this further. We are going to be meeting with the NTA. There is a lot of work to be done here on rural transport. I think the fact that we can see how much of a contributor it is to carbon emissions is an important point to show how seriously we need to take this and how we need to invest. And I see Hazel there, looks like she's ready to say, okay, Roisin, Can I just say thanks a million to everybody for coming to this event. I'm really proud to see the Green Party having a main stage event on rural transport. I think she might have cut me off there. And I want to say thanks
We
to
can still hear
James.
you, Roisin.
Thanks to James
There
and
you go.
Brian and on Lewin. You've been great, and all the contributors as well. There's loads more coming in. I'm so sorry. Feel free to email any of us for answers to the questions we didn't get to. Very great to see so much enthusiasm and passion. Thank you all for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday and the other events we have coming up at this great Ardèche, for want of a better word.